All right, well, hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 443rd New Social Environment. I'm Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation on Edward Hicks featuring Sanford Schwartz, Choghakate Kazarian, and Brandt Junceau. We're thrilled to have the poet David Zaza here, who will read to close today's program. A few notes before we get started. The Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we'll be posting shortly. Over the past 21 years here at the Rail, we've undertaken a miraculous journey, bringing together in a single monthly publication, art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, alongside thoughtful social and political meditations. As a small nonprofit, we need your support. This December, we are fundraising $150,000 in 31 days, and your contributions will directly support our writers, guest artists, production staff, and our operations here at the Rail for the coming year. Please check the chat for more information and links to donate, which we'll also be posting in just a moment. But now to introduce today's guest and hosts. American critic Sanford Schwartz is the author of several books, mostly studies of lesser known painters, including modern American artist Rackstraw Downes, 19th century Danish artist Christen Købke, and turn-of-the-20th-century British painter William Nicholson, as well as many shorter pieces of art and literary criticism. His most recent book is On Edward Hicks, now available from Lucia Marquand and distributed by Artbook DAP. We'll be posting a link in a moment for you to get a copy of that book. Our host today, curator and art historian Choghakate Kazarian, was formerly a curator at the Musée d'Art Moderne de Paris. She has curated exhibitions on artists such as Lucio Fontana, Piero Manzoni, Karel Appel, and Henry Darger, among others. She's an editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail and is a PhD candidate at the Courtauld Institute of Art, where she is writing a dissertation on Albert Pinkham Ryder. Last but not least, contemporary artist and writer Brandt Junceau is best known for his figurative sculpture. He received a BA from Bard College in 1981 and has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Pollock Krasner Artist Grant, and has exhibited internationally. He's a contributor to Artforum and here at the Brooklyn Rail, and is represented by Galerie Greta Mert in Brussels. Without further ado, Brandt, take it away.
Sandy, I think we should get right to the animals.
Oh,
and as a contemporary artist with an interest in self, other, unconscious, and kind of inside-out view of human nature, your sentence on Hicks as a producer of inside-out masterpieces really caught my attention.
When you say get to the animals, I mean, what they meant to him, or?
Yeah, and their relative importance against the figures in the images.
Well, in a way, I see the animals. I mean, before I say that, I think it's important to say, maybe people know this, maybe they don't know this, that the paintings called The Peaceable Kingdom are based on a passage in the Old Testament in Isaiah. And I think in this very image that you have here, which is the Peaceable Kingdom in the Metropolitan Museum, Hicks has put on the bottom somewhere, yes, underneath the leopard, where you can find the passage. And Isaiah was a great prophet, and he foresaw a time when predatory animals would come together with tame animals, carnivores with vegetarians, and dwell in peace. And it's a passage that, oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly, has almost never been done in a work of art. It was found by an art historian that there is an illustration of this, there is an embodiment of this passage in stone and the cathedral in Orvieto, and that was it, at least at that time when he wrote in the early 50s. So this is Hicks's idea that no one has come close to, and it has been thought to be, in some ways, a poster almost for Quaker thinking, Quaker pacifism, Quaker renunciation of arms. Edward Hicks, maybe this is known, this is generally what one sees on a wall label in a museum. Edward Hicks was a Quaker. More than that, he was a Quaker minister. What's not said is he was in his time a very famous preacher, and known beyond Quaker circles in the 1820s, 30s, and 1840s. And the animals are divided amongst those that that Isaiah very specifically enumerates. Each predatory animal, now calmer, now in another state, is with a tame animal who could be a mate. And there are 4 predatory animals, carnivores: the lion, the leopard, the wolf, and down at the bottom you can see the bear. That's the leopard. And each one of these has a kind of mate. On this picture we're looking at now, I believe the white and brown furry thing. And this is a nice picture, by the way, because you can see, you get a real sense of the way Hicks paints. And that was one of the things that drew me to him. He's a very luscious painter. So there's a lot of visible brushwork, which is important to me. It's very appealing. Anyway, that brown and pale brown and white furry thing, I believe, is the kid or the goat, which accompanies the leopard. In, I think, the previous image, yes, yes, that's the kid. The rear end of the kid is nuzzling up into the leopard's neck. The lion's mate often is thought to be a lamb. People always say the lion will lie down with the lamb. Well, that may be, but it's not in Isaiah and it's not in Hicks. The lion's mate, the lion is with the ox, and then the bear and the cow, which we see down here in the lower right, are brought together to feed. That's what Isaiah says. They feed together. They commingle. And then the final group, which is not so visible in this one, but becomes very visible in some others, is the wolf and the lamb. And the lamb, or the wolf and the sheep, which is an expression we all know, the wolf in sheep's clothing, and those two are together. By the way, the wolf in this picture is maybe not one of Hicks's greater wolves. In some pictures, the wolf really has both a contained but a more dynamic presence. And then finally, you have these other animals, because Isaiah talks about the offspring of these 8 creatures, sometimes being part of this and sometimes not being part of this. And he says finally that a little child shall lead them. And in this particular painting in the Met, the little child is rather voluminous, and seems to be a young girl. Seems to be a girl. In other pictures, the child is very definitely a boy, and in other pictures, the child becomes something of a sprite, and it's hardly there at all. So the animals have this background, this importance. It's about them, and Hicks had, obviously strong feelings about each one of them and what they represent. So.
I love that there's so much light in the sky and that the animals come in from the dark.
Yeah.
Like the lion's foreleg has this kind of black shadows almost painted around it, like the border.
Yeah, the leopard too.
The shadow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. It makes them more volumetric. It's we don't know what Hicks knew about about painting. I mean, he didn't talk about it. So he didn't talk about technique. That would have it would have been just anathema to him. But he did do signs in Newtown, where he lived, Newtown, Pennsylvania, which is in Bucks County, outside of Philadelphia. And in his signs, he would have put, backgrounds. He was a beautiful letterer as well. So I think that's where that comes from.
I think you can see sign painting in these pictures because they're so clearly sequential.
Yeah.
The one touch over another, the last touch is the completion of the image, and it's out the door.
Yeah. Yeah, there were signs across the river. One sign said, you were something to the effect of you were entering, Pennsylvania. The other side, you were entering New Jersey. So he did those, and he also did street signs because he supported himself and his family as a commercial painter.
I think we should point out that although Hicks and his contemporaries were closer to the animal world than we are, he had never seen some of these animals. I mean, the leopard, for instance. No,
he took everything from illustrations that he could get in gazettes, in the Bible. Bibles were generally illustrated in those years with little black and white illustrations. Everything he worked from was small and black and white. And so the color and the shape, size, it's all him.
So we think there might be no such thing as a Hicks drawing in our sense.
There is a vague drawing or two. Yeah, it's reproduced in one of the books, but it's its authorship is questionable. So,
because I mean, he was painting over most of the planning and design and prep that he did.
I would think so. Sure. You mean one layer coming on top?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's where look. I mean, when you see the top of the cow and you see that beautiful white brushwork, that's clearly on top of something that existed.
But he's composing found elements. I mean, almost literally cutting and pasting.
Yeah, these are collages. Yeah, they started off that way, and I think they continued. But what happened, I think, because he worked over these over 30 years. And I think that by the 1840s, his last decade, he was really very free and loose with the work that he was working from. I mean, he at that point he owned these animals. He knew them inside and out as characters because they each have an emotional, psychological reverberation for him, and he moved them around whichever way he wanted.
And he visited this composition, like, is it 60 times?
There may be 60, 61, or 62. Or this is the Brooklyn Museum's painting. It's a great one. I love this. It's not very big. There are a series of these, maybe 3 more. Philadelphia has one where the lion and the leopard in particular are really like spooked. They are, they have these fabulous, crazy eyes.
It seems that no matter how serene the occasion, that each animal is bringing its former character with it.
Certainly the carnivores, which are the interesting ones. They're the ones that he loved. He wasn't supposed to as a Quaker minister. And one interpretation of these paintings is that during the period when he was making these paintings, there was a lot of unrest in the Quaker community, which was sort of centered in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, but also extended as high as Boston and as far south as North Carolina. And the separation was between rural Quakers who were not so well to do and city Quakers who were making it big time. And in Pennsylvania as well, there was a period there where Quakers were also part of the Pennsylvania Assembly, so they were part of the government. And by the 1820s, the late 1820s, there was a real sense of division between the well-to-do urban Quakers and the rural Quakers in terms of how they would proceed in their religion, how they would go ahead with what it meant to be a Quaker. On the one hand, the people in the countryside wanted to stay with the mystic origins of their faith and have a faith that was about individuals approaching God in their own way.
And that was Edward's faction.
That was Edward's faction. And they were called the Hicksite, not because of Edward, but because of his cousin, Elias. The city, we'll call them city, Quakers, were actually edging towards something evangelical, which seems odd and strange because they were a more moneyed group. Mm-hmm. They were also edging towards the idea of having regularized religious observance with a pastor or priest or father, with a book to read, with a creed, with a sense of religion that was an organized entity, which is exactly what Quakerism initially rejected. So,
my understanding of Quakerism, the first concept in my mind is the kind of eruptive mode of the meetings where people speak extemporaneously in an unstructured fashion, which seems so congenial to Hicks' temperament.
Yeah.
And you could therefore see him really struggling against this other movement to regularize and program the experience.
Yeah. That meeting where you sit for an hour in silence and you speak when you want to speak and no one is organizing anything is, I think, the most radical and the most interesting achievement and part of Quakerism. And it exists today. Not in every Quaker meeting, but in some. The one I went to at downtown is organized that way. But if I could just get back to the Brooklyn painting for a second with the two spooked cats, with those black, the blackness around their eyes.
You mean in that painting?
This is the Brooklyn painting.
Yeah.
And it has been thought that this painting was done, I think, in the early 1830s. And this was after there really was literally formally a separation amongst the Quakers. It was with a capital S, it was a separation. And it has, that's the line in that painting. It has been thought that Hicks was painting his own guilt and his surprise at the fact that the separation had actually come about. And for a Quaker, certainly someone as connected to the religion as Hicks was, it was a very significant and frightening thing. And in pictures coming later, the lion and the leopard become more subdued, and the idea of the separation between one kind of Quaker and another, which was really big news at the time. I mean, people who were not Quaker knew about this turmoil within this religion. In time, they continued to be schisms, but it passed. It passed in terms of what Hicks was doing, and it passed in terms of how Quakers lived. But schisms between Quakers remained on an ongoing thing, I believe, through the century. This is a detail of the lion's face from the painting at Yale, which is a late Hicks kingdom. And this lion, which we don't get in this picture because just the detail, is very stooped. There it is. He's stooped and clearly very much older.
It's practically a human face.
They're so fascinating hearing you speak about Hicks, because he's someone that has fascinated me for a while. And coming from being non-American and having this European culture, I've always looked at Hicks as something very foreign, very exotic. And for me, I see him as the first American easel painter in the history of American art. But I think he's exotic and strange and foreign in so many ways for me. And I've been trying to figure out the place of this painterly practice into his own life, and also regarding his other practices, because for me there's Hicks the preacher, the minister, there's Hicks the professional painter who paints carriages, and then there's a third Edward Hicks who is the painter of the peaceable kingdom and all these paintings. It's almost as if we cannot say that he's a sort of self-taught artist, or because he was a professional painter, but these paintings were more of a Sunday painter kind of practice in a way, because they were not motivated commercially speaking. He was mostly giving them as gifts or keeping them for himself. And also because it was almost speaking of Sunday practice, Sunday painter is probably some anachronism I'm doing for 19th century, but in a way it was a very private practice for him, and something also almost secret, because he wasn't, he wrote a lot, but he wasn't speaking of himself as a kind of easel painter. And it almost reminds me of so many patterns that we see in 20th century outside artists. That I'm thinking of Henry Darger, who wrote his autobiography, but never mentions about him as an artist. And there's so many ways that, well, Hicks is a professional painter, but he has this Sunday painter practice on the side of his professional painting activity, and he's also a minister. And I would like you to speak about this interaction of all these different practices that you have, he had three jobs that are connected in a way.
Yeah. Well, one thing is that it wasn't a secret. He didn't advertise.
It wasn't public, let's say. Maybe not secret, but not super public.
His studio office was part of the house that he built, which is right there now on Penn Street. And you can see it. And I met the woman who lives there now. I said to her, I'm writing about Edward Hicks. She said, "You have a new angle." I said, "I hope so." Anyway, and you can, and the house is very well situated, because, as I say in the book, right behind the house, you can see the meeting, and you can also see where Hicks is buried. And so people would come in and they would talk to him, townsfolk and friends, and he knew a lot of people. He knew a great number of people, and they'd say, I want to commission, I have this kind of carriage, or I have this sled, and I need to have it painted, or I have a clock. Clocks in those days were often, they were wood and they were pink. So he did all of that kind of work, and we don't know for sure. I'm speculating that a kingdom or two would be there and they could see it. And he had we know of at least 3 commissions. We also know that he did this kind of stuff slightly under the radar. The elders of the community were not nuts about his being a painter. It was fine for him to be a commercial painter, a utilitarian painter. That was acceptable, although not, because there's great furniture at that period made by Quakers. You could be involved in the arts, but he had a great value to the religious community, and that he was a first-class minister. He traveled a great deal. He was very good at it. A lot of people wanted to hear about him, and I have an anecdote in the book about someone hearing about him in St. Louis, and he never got that far. He got as far as Canada. He got as far as Virginia, but not that far west. Anyway, so you would go to him. You would know that he did the commercial work. You might see some of his things around. You might commission one. But I think what about Edward Hicks is like what we've come to understand as outsider art is that, to some degree, like Martin Ramirez or Darger. He needed to make these. He just needed to do this. And if no one wanted it, okay. And then X number of months later, he was working on another one. I mean, he was just essentially, he had an artist's gene, and it was an important one.
Yeah, you say that he was speaking about his excessive fondness for painting.
Right.
That's how he talked about his passion.
Yes, but that's very tricky because because we don't know from that if he was talking about his work as a designer, as a decorator, as the guy who did most of the signs in the town. He did the sign for the new library, which is extant. So it's very hard to know what he meant by that. But in his writings, which are great in length, by which I mean his memoir, and then his diary, and then the sermons that we have, and the sermons would not have been written by Edward; they would have been taken down by a stenographer. In all of that, he never talks about making easel paintings. He never once mentions the Peaceable Kingdom. He talks about painting really as no more than painting, taking a brush. I mean, that's it. It's very limited. He's very shrewd and coy, I think, on this issue, because just to announce himself as a painter of any of this would not have been met with favor. He really was able to hang on because he was great as a minister, and they countenanced it. There was a silent deal, I'm pretty sure. And then late in his life, like for instance, what we're looking at now is a farm painting. And in his last 5 or 6 years, I think he went haywire. I mean, I think he was ending his life as a painter. I think he was pouring his most personal things into his paintings. He's there as a little boy next to the woman with the large lap. That was his foster mother, Elizabeth Twining, and that's his foster father, David Twining. That's where he was brought up, on the Twining farm, and which until the last number of years was still available to be seen in some way in Newtown. Now it's, of course, it's a suburban development. I was told that as recently as the 70s, Newtown looked the way Hicks knew it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting that you said that he was pouring himself into his paintings, and reading your books, and when you comment about not only the painting, but also the writings of Hicks, basically I have the impression that I mean, these paintings are more of a diary than his written diaries or memoirs.
Yeah.
He speaks more about, it's almost like a therapy for him, because you speak about that very at length in the book, that how much, because he worked on this for 3 decades, and how much you can see in the evolution of the paintings, his own struggles. And this is probably one of the most beautiful aspects, I think, of this series, that he was just struggling. He was not a dogmatic religious person. That's how I see it. But he had his own struggles between what he was saying, what he was preaching, and his own behavior. And I think that was so beautiful, that it kind of, this series of painting documented his own personal struggles.
Yeah, it's very possible to look at these pictures as a kind of solace and a kind of therapy, and mostly as a kind of atonement for him.
Yeah, atonement was the word you were using.
Not the farm paintings, but the kingdoms, because the kingdoms are about coming to an accord, coming to comedy, coming to a resolution of violent, disparate feelings, which is what he was after a lot, because he was, as he says many times in his memoir, he was a violent. He was at times afraid of his own violence. He was very intemperate. He was very opinionated. His biographer wrote that his mouth was legendary in the community at the time. I mean, he would say what he felt.
He mentions at some point as a young man he was profane. Right?
Well, the thing, yes, he does that. And in some way, this has to be taken in relation to a typical Quaker journal. Quakers, especially if they were ministers or elders, were kind of like assumed that they would be writing a journal. They would be writing their life story. And aside from the Bible, the individual journals were the most read of anything by Quakers. And to start off as profane, to start off as perhaps someone who drank too much, perhaps someone who maybe even danced. These are all the things that, you know, you want. This is biblical. These are the things that you want to move away from as you gain your religious maturity. So in part, what Edward was writing was generic to a Quaker minister. But we know enough about him and his mouth that we know that he may very well have been cutting closer to a truth than the generic idea of a religious person casting aside their foibles, their mundane existence, and becoming spiritual. This painting that you're looking at now is also at Yale. It's interesting. Yale has a great collection of Hicks in the sense that they have this very early one, and they have the one that we have just seen, which is a very late one. And this early one here is taken very closely from the source that Hicks worked from in the beginning. The source was an illustration in black and white in a Bible that had been drawn, and it has the child very much like this child holding the lion, the cow. There's a cow in the background that which I believe is a cow and not an ox. This image, he took not the whole image, not the landscape, but the child and the animals from the initiating little reproduction that he saw. And the child in the beginning, this is not the first one, by the way, but it's a very early one of the earliest. And it's interesting too, because Hicks threw in that's something that's real. So you may have seen it. It's the Natural Bridge in Virginia. Is it still a bridge? I don't know.
This one looks almost like late masonry.
Yeah, this was taken from a map of the colonies, although no, maybe the United States, because it was from the 1820s, not the colony. And Hicks imported that. And it's intriguing to see because way in the background, you can see William Penn and his meeting with the Lenape. And that's something, you know, Hicks, as he moved along, he got rid of the bridge there and brought the William Penn and other Quakers having their meeting with the Lenape forward. And what's interesting about this painting also, in relation to the one we just saw, the two Yale paintings, is that in the Yale painting, if Nick, we could go back to the one we were just in. Yeah, you can see the Natural Bridge, which has been sort of restructured, is now brought over to the other side. But what's interesting is that it's called the Natural Bridge with a capital N, capital B, in Virginia, is something that he only used at the very beginning in the one we just previously saw. He used it again here, and he used it very few times. Mostly what he has behind the animals are a number of trees that sort of give one a sense of a full forest, but it's not a full forest. It's really just a couple of trees. And so I think that
broken tree seems significant too.
The broken tree,
like hit by lightning, maybe.
Yeah, and it's funny because the broken tree has the same quality as the stable in pictures of the Nativity. The stable that the Christ child and his mother are in is broken.
Yeah,
There's almost no ceiling,
Mhm.
and the walls are crumbling. It can be a shed. In Piero's painting, it's Kenneth Clark calls it a shed, but usually it's a stable. Sometimes it becomes a large house, but it's always in a state of decay and corrosion. And the point is, and I think it relates to this tree, is that the Christ child represents a new dispensation, a new world that is happening within a broken building. You know what I mean? And I think that Hicks may have been doing something like this, that the animals are coming together in the spirit of accord in a world that is partly already broken.
That requires repair.
Yeah.
Not
sure
in
about
the early Yale picture, it strikes me that the tiny group of Penn and the Indians are upstream from the child and the animals. So
Yeah.
it's as if the verse in Isaiah is a consequence of the meeting between Penn. It's almost like a Quaker generated resolution. And then later it seems simultaneous because the body of water doesn't appear to flow.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. The whole background is taken from a picture by Asher Durand, who was a contemporary landscape artist, which is interesting. And one thing I just want to point out about this Yale painting, it's very interesting. You see the leopard, and right just right near the leopard, there's some kind of,
it's ghostly.
Yeah, it's really ghostly. It's really terrific. It's beautifully painted. It has, I mean, there's an aspect of Hicks's painting which feels to me European. I mean, I know you mentioned that. It just
maybe because of the sources, the bridge, and some, because you spoke a lot about how he mixes and uses different sources for his images.
He has a real sketch style at times that has some kind of it's almost analogous with, you know, something you'd see in a Titian or something you'd see in Venetian painting. And that bit of the kid coming through, I think is just really beautiful.
And speaking of evolution throughout this series, I think you mentioned that he didn't sign the paintings, except that at the end of his life, he started signing it. Do you know why he suddenly started signing them? Is it the kind of late life thing, just to put his mark on his babies? Or that's very curious about his self-identification as an artist through the signature. Is really strong.
Well, I'm speculating here. I think that based on the work that he was doing in his last 5-6 years, which is when he did have his name on the back, I think he was very proud of what he was doing and increasingly thinking of himself as an artist.
He was more productive in this series at the end.
Yeah, and he took on all these other themes that he never did farm paintings early on. He only did farm paintings at the end. And there aren't maybe more than 5 or 7 of them,
which are extraordinary. It looks like paintings from the 1930s.
Yeah.
This one is like, for me, it's just extraordinary.
This is a very large painting. I think this painting could be 4 feet or so on a side. It's in the National Gallery. It's called the Cornell Farm, and it's a picture. I don't think we know that this was commissioned or not. It seems like it should have been commissioned. Because it's a big undertaking, and you, Brandt, you were pointing out the other day, the figures are interesting because they're moving their arms one way or the other, and you feel that Hicks got that from some gazette or some illustration somewhere, and he just flipped them because sometimes the arm is going this way and sometimes the arm is going this way, and you could see those little guys in the background. They're the black pigs, on top of which are 4 human beings. Then if we move over to the right, there are 2 guys, and there's a guy way in the distance. And, you know, some of them are still doing this thing with the arms, and as one of the 2 is doing over on the left. So that's probably all the same person. Just the way, you know, the animals are.
And no carnivores, no dark forest.
Yeah, no, this is different. And then in addition to the farms, he also at the end made Noah's Ark forget if we have Noah's Ark.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, if I don't know if Nick, if that's available, but that's also something of an anomaly. This comes from a print that had been published 2 years before by Nathaniel Currier. So lots of Americans knew about this. And I think Hicks was drawn to it. Well, Forensic gave him, you know, a field day for animals.
Yeah.
And then in addition, it gave him a chance to do something that he was thinking about, I believe, a great deal in the end, which is how do you show animals on the move? Because the last paintings increasingly are about animals moving as opposed to just sitting in that sort of formation that we see at the beginning. And my impression is that the two animals here that chiefly look at us are the old lion, and then up above going onto the ramp, closer to the ramp getting into the ark, you see the young lion, which looks like a tiger because of the stripes. It's also looking in our direction.
The only ones who do.
Yeah, well, it's possible you could say that this creature over here, just to the you see where the two horses are, and in between the horses and the lion, that's a creature that I don't know what it is. It's like an antelope. Could be looking at us, but yeah, just a little lower, but you're not really sure. It doesn't have the directed gaze of the lion. I mean, the lion is clearly saying hello. It's acknowledging us. The other animals have eyes that could be parallel to us, but they're not in the spirit of looking. Whereas the lion, you can feel the turned body. It's saying like, okay, you know, and the creature at the top sometimes is called a tiglon, which is a cross between a male lion and a female tiger. And that creature appears periodically in Hicks's kingdoms.
You know, it's like they're the only animals with self-consciousness in it.
The cats.
Yeah, and it seems like they have second thoughts or regrets or you know, some wistful feeling of loss leaving this world. It's perfectly.
Well, I think that the lion has thoughts like that all the way through. In the very first kingdom, which is that we know of, which is a painting in the Cleveland Museum, the lion is already thinking about something. I mean, you can tell that the lion has something on its mind. Some of the animals are vacant. The lion is almost always thinking.
It's almost like something that's happening in the lion's head.
And it's fabulous because I mean, Hicks is known for his animals, but in this painting, the way he represents the ark as sort of box is extraordinary. And also the sky, I think you said in your book that it's in the history of American painting, this sky is one of the most amazing ones.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. And the ark itself in its largeness is not original, in that it is in the Currier print. And what's not in the print are those two trees, and I love those two trees because they seem to have a godly force. They're holding up the coming storm. They're keeping it at bay until the animals can board. And what's also interesting about the trees is that they too are a couple. Like all the other couples. And is this the full picture? Is it cropped a little on the sides? Because on the very top left, the sky clears, and it's not clear whether it's not. Yeah, I guess this is the whole picture. Thanks, Nick. The intriguing thing to me is always is the storm going to go away, or is it first taking over? And you can also see here in this picture now all the birds, which seem to be animating the clouds, and you can also get a sense of what's really beautiful. One of the beautiful things about this painting is the way those red leaves, those branches with all the red leaves look great against the gray. So it's a particular combination of colors that you just don't see a lot of.
Emotional combination.
Yeah, it's this great painting.
And the entire thing is happening without human guidance.
Is Noah around?
It's
This-
one of those little pointing guys.
Yeah.
This painting for years, it is owned by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And this painting for years has been in the sort of colonial, not colonial, but in a period room that has a lot of pottery and has a lot of. It's one of the very few paintings in that room. It's not a room about painting. It's a room about earlier American crafts. And I'm very interested to see. I know that the museum has rehung everything for the new Frank Gehry interior of the museum, and I'm dying to find out if they've brought this out, because I think it's a phenomenal painting. And Philadelphia also has one of the early ones too, which is very strong.
You know, we should have a few words on how it is that Hicks is kind of sequestered among, naive artists.
Like folk furniture makers also. Yes.
That's where he is in auction houses as well.
With furniture, he's always
He's-
with furniture
yeah.
and objects, and it's funny because he's always this is the context where we see him with furniture, crafts, etc. But on the other hand, the more I look at this series of Peaceable Kingdoms, I mean, the modernist in me cannot just not think about it as almost a conceptual work of art, because why do 60 of the same painting? There was no economical or external reason to do that. And, even if he was interested in a religious moral aspect of the subject, there were tons of other moral subjects in the Bible alone that he could have used and he knew about. So that's something I will want your opinion about. Why choose this specific subject 60 times? It's also a question to Brandt as an artist, but why use the same subject 60 times, even with variations?
Well, I mean, in some ways it wasn't it's a funny thing. What is the subject?
Yes, that's another question.
In a way, you could say he was, this all may sound a little, specious, but, I mean, why did Mondrian keep on going back to the grid and reworking the grid, reworking it continually until the grid becomes something else?
And that's why I see Hicks in a way more of a modernist, wave in mind frame because of that.
I would agree, because folk artists, for the most part, folk art, especially in the United States, and maybe in Europe, I don't know, you would know. I mean, it was kind of a business. Folk artists made portraits, they made landscapes, and they made still lifes because there was a demand for this, for cut rate versions of the same kinds of paintings that people would get from name art, more expensive artists in urban areas. Outsider artists don't work as a business. They work because they have a message that they cannot help but bring out.
There's a need.
There's a need, and
there's no audience necessarily.
Hicks had a need for this. If you wanted to buy it, great. He didn't make it in that direction. Whereas if you were a folk artist like Amy Phillips or whatever, when you made your portrait, you expected perhaps even to be paid beforehand. And so there's this really a profound difference between Hicks and Amy Phillips, who's a wonderful artist. The United States has wonderful folk painters.
One of the great.
Yeah, up until about the 1840s, when it kind of falls apart because of photography, the introduction of photography. I don't know if I answered. I forgot.
Brad, do you want to bring your contribution?
Oh yeah,
necessity to just go on the same. I mean, not maybe the same subject, but the same iconography.
Well, yeah.
I think this relates to the profanity that I mentioned earlier. I remember the sentence being Hicks speaking of his youth, and he speaks of himself as it's not in terms of the sacred and profane, he speaks of himself as a master of profanity. And it reminds me of the little Mark Twain anecdote where he says he was somewhere on the river on a steamboat and heard crewmen turning the air blue, and he says, God, I wish I could swear like that. And I have this sense that with Hicks, there's this eruptive, rude, impolite impulse that he can bring out without words safely, and couch ultimately as a kind of a resolution of his interior life. But it's the unruliness of the interior life that I find really attractive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, his life story, which is then that he was given up. His mother died when he was a year and a half, and his father, within a short time, gave him up to be brought up by an adoptive family.
The Twinings.
The Twinings. And he saw his father thereafter. His father was in the same town, but he didn't have a lot of warmth towards his father. Didn't have a lot of communication with his father, and I think the family, the Hicks family, was well-to-do. His father and his grandfather owned slaves, and there was something sort of torn apart by him that he was not aware of when he was a year and a half old necessarily, but he certainly would have been aware of when he was 5, 8 years old, that he came from elsewhere and he was given up, and that his mother died when he was that age. And the story, which is written about, or shall I say confirmed by 2 very authoritative writers on Hicks, is that when he died, he had in his pocket letters from his mother that he could never give up. They were letters from his mother to his father, and they put even his father in a different light because they're love letters. So when you talk about a rawness and an unruliness within, I definitely agree. I mean, these are passionate paintings, and I think that the lion and to some degree the leopard are, like among the really great characters in American painting. Great the way some of Aiken's portraits of women at the end are. They have a real depth, an emotional depth, which is not true of a lot of American 19th century art. It's not a period of passionate painting.
We mentioned the letters he was carrying from mother to father and vice versa. It reminded me of something you mentioned earlier, that the animals, although they're, except for the lions, sometimes with the lioness, they're not paired off by gender, but there's almost a kind of a gender fluidity among them by temperament and character, that you could almost pair them up cross species.
Yeah, Nick, could we go back to another Peaceable Kingdom? Maybe the one any of them. We have the Metz one and we have the Yale one.
Yeah, the Metz is good in this light.
If that's possible. I would sort of.
It kind of like it recalls to me the Jungian thing between anima and animo in the soul.
I think when people see a kingdom, especially a kingdom where the ox is with the lion, and they're always, or very often, literally touching.
Yeah.
Even if they're in a different space, like the ox could be further back towards the water, but they touch. And people think that the ox is feminine, the lion is masculine. I mean, this is sort of something that we just, I don't know.
The ox is gelded.
So the ox starts off life as a male ox.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't know where I saw this, maybe it's in Isaiah, maybe Hicks mentions this. We can think of all 8 of the major players as male. And then they have their mates and the offspring. It's startling in some paintings to see the female lion with her cubs. The child in this painting has her arm around an offspring of the lion, but we don't necessarily.
Or lioness.
The lion. We don't see his mother. And maybe this is not an offspring, but rather the lion's mate. It's not clear.
Maybe we can go see the images of the same subject by Horace Pippin, because to speak about it, I think that's so interesting to see how another artist, different background, different period, has worked on this same subject.
I think that, Nick, I think that the Pippins are in the front. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Horace Pippin, who died around 1946, 48, somewhere in there. These are towards the end of his life. Horace Pippin lived outside of Philadelphia, and it's funny. He lived outside of Philadelphia, roughly the same distance in one direction as Hicks lived outside of Philadelphia in the other direction. And Horace Pippin's dealer was a man named Robert Carlin, who was in Philadelphia. And although Robert Carlin was not a dealer for Edward Hicks, because Edward Hicks never had a dealer, never had a show, Robert Carlin bought as many Hickses as he possibly could and sold as many as he could. He was on the Hicks trail for decades. And so Horace Pippin would have been prodded in the direction of making a picture like this because of Robert Carlin, who would come into Philadelphia and see these all the time. Robert Carlin's daughter talks about Hicks paintings being in the house all the time. There was always a Hicks painting, at least one. And what Pippin did was he made 3 of these, and he made a 4th, which he didn't finish, which is in the Met. He called them all Holy Mountain, and then he numbered them. Holy Mountain is words that appear in the prophecy by Isaiah 11. At the very end of Isaiah's writing, he foresees that the coming together of these different animals will all take place on my holy mountain. Hicks's pictures are very free, and this is maybe the second one. He has the date on it, December 7th.
The previous one is dated D-Day.
Yeah.
And this is dated December 7th.
Yeah.
It's kind of I can't imagine it's not completely
you can see the burial sites in the back through the trees. And in the third one, which I reproduced in my book, which is in the Hirshhorn, you see soldiers running through the back behind the trees. Maybe you can even see them here. If you look very closely, you can see some brown figures on the left-hand side. Yeah, there they are. One of them may even have
modern weapons.
One may have a rifle, and you can see a lynching on the very left.
Oh, yes, yes.
These are all Black people, in the sense that Horace Pippin was in a unit in the First World War which became known idiomatically as the Harlem Hellfighters, and it was a fantastically they achieved real fame to the extent that a Black unit could. When they went over in 1917, they were actually the Americans. They were, of course, an American unit. They were an American unit. They're from New York, but they were taken over and run by the French. Intriguingly, and Horace Pippin wrote about that period. He made drawings about that period, and so for him to have burial crosses that would definitely be from the First World War, and soldiers running through the back, and a person being lynched, has to do with it. You know what this is? It's very similar to that blasted tree in that Hicks Peaceable Kingdom in Yale that you were talking about, or the Christ child in a blasted shed or stable. It represents, in a way, an evil past, a past of ruination and loss that is still with us, but with the newness of either the Christ child, or in this case, a good shepherd who is a Black person, subduing these violent animals. Something that's hopefully beneficial, that represents a unity and accord, is taking place in a world that still has, through the trees in the background, the dead of the First World War, the lynching that's going on now.
Yeah.
I mean, Horace Pippin's awareness of his status as a Black man in 1930s and 1940s America is not totally clear, except he drops hints periodically. And this image gave him a chance to do it again in a subtle and interesting way.
And in this image, the animals and people have traded places in the darkness. That in Hicks, the animals are coming from darkness, and here the animals are in the light, and human beings are interacting in
Yeah.
the gloom of the forest.
Maybe, Sandy, you would like to speak about Fernand Léger, because you mentioned somehow how he discovered the work of Edward Hicks, which is something so unusual and unexpected, to have someone who is like he embodies European modernism in the way he looks at. I mean, he's not the only modernist artist looking at what is qualified folk, self-taught, or naive art.
Yeah. I think it had something to do with the timing as well. Léger's first visit to the States was in, I think, 1930, 1931. And it's intriguing because that is the very moment that Hicks was discovered and seen in New York galleries. He was Edith Greger Halpert. Recently, there was a very good show of Mrs. Halpert and the artists that she showed at the Jewish Museum. I can't remember, and maybe I don't even know whether Léger saw an exhibition, but in the early 30s, Hicks went from being unknown to being considered the face of American folk art, which then started to be sold in number and given, very nice displays in galleries. And that was when Léger was here. So he had a full opportunity to see really strong ones. And with his feeling, presumably already for Rousseau, Nick's painting, his eyes would have been receptive to Hicks, I think. And he actually also then went on, he was prodded to put down his thoughts, and his thoughts appeared in an article in the Art Digest in New York publication in 1931. And he said that Hicks was the greatest painter he had seen in America. This painting, Leisure, is dated 1944 to 1949, I think. And at the bottom, there's a piece of paper and says, homage à Louis David. So it's about, oh no, it's not down there. She's holding it. I felt that somehow or other, there was a strong connection with Hicks. I mean, we don't have other major European masters exclaiming over Hicks, just Léger. And I mean, they
wouldn't have had a chance.
You would have had to come here to see
in that year
Hicks. Then.
I mean, still today, pre-war American art is still very exotic for any European or non-American. There are basically no works of American art outside, from that period outside of the United States.
And then I thought that the structure of the picture, most particularly with the woman with her leg outstretched, just seemed such an echo of that image that occasionally when Hicks, plants the leopard as this very long horizontal figure at the bottom, and I don't know, there's always for me something sexual about the leopard. That the leopard is kind of like eyeing us in a way that sort
He's a
of
sexual animal in
reminds
general.
me
Yeah.
of the woman in Manet's painting of Olympia, who's really looking at us in a way, you know, and it's a complex look, and it breaks right through the surface of the picture and hits us, and the leopard does it, and I think she does it too, to a degree. But anyway, I don't know if there are any other connections with Leger, but and then the other image that you found was funny too, the tango.
Can we bring this other image? You want
This, yeah,
Brandt to say a word?
well, I don't know. This is Brandt's contribution. All I can think of is the Gene Hackman. This should be the lion.
Oh, let's bring that image.
yeah, it's fine.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I don't know. It's what you felt there was a connection, maybe because of the person, because of
Well,
Owen
We're
Wilson.
pulling the string.
and
Yeah.
the film revisits the family over a period of time. So it's like a tableau that you know, develops over time, and the cast of characters
Oh, I think
appear
it's
over and over
great. Yeah.
in out of chronological sequence, but it's like they keep reappearing.
Well, you know, the thing about the Leger and the thing about the Royal Tenenbaums is that like the Hicks, they're about a family. And even the two little ones that Ben, what's his name? Ben Stiller is holding, remind me of the two animals. In the background of a number of the Peaceable Kingdoms, you see two very small kids, and they are also in Isaiah. And then let's not forget the bird on Pete, is his name Pete Wilson? The other that on Luke's shoulder. Yeah. So in some of the kingdoms, there is an American eagle who pops in much the same way. So anyway, I certainly can see this as a
this
analogous.
brings up the title of your first chapter, The Outdoor Living Room.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Well, because I mean, yeah, I guess I think of them as a family. I mean, it is. It's not a meeting, although there's an element of the Quaker meeting involved. Nick, if we could see another kingdom, a peaceable kingdom. Yeah, I mean, Hicks, if you were a preacher at a meeting, I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting, but generally there's a raised section, and that would be for the ministers and maybe the elders. So Hicks was always looking out on a group of people who were there for some kind of communion with one another, and this could be a version of the silent meeting for prayer, which we talked about earlier, the famous hour of silence when anyone says what they want to say. Yeah, this is one of the great ones, I think. This painting in the Brooklyn Museum, I was told as recently, I haven't been in Brooklyn for a while, but someone told me within the last year it was rehung. So when you get up on the 5th floor, there it is, right in front of you. It's a knockout.
You know, before we exit, we should bring up Crazy Cat and Sharon Horvath.
Yeah. This reproduction shows the picture out of its frame. You see what I mean? Yeah, I don't know where they are. Does Nick have those? Does Nick have the?
Yeah.
Oh, right. I brought this in because there was something intriguing to me. First of all, I'm a big fan of George Harriman, like everybody else, and George Harriman's newspaper strip, Crazy Cat, was on the boards and appeared in newspapers from 1913 to 1944. It stopped with his death, and it revolves around these three characters: Crazy Cat, Officer Pup, and then Ignatz Mouse. And it struck me that it was so interesting because Harriman, who had done other things before he landed on the conception of Crazy Cat, which he then stuck with, was revisiting the same characters in slightly revolving background scenes for 30 odd years. And it was exactly what Hicks did. He worked with the same characters for 30 years. And the relationship between these characters had some similarity in the sense that Crazy Cat is basically the protagonist of the event. Ignatz Mouse, and so therefore would be something like the lion. Ignatz Mouse, who is always looking to throw a brick at Crazy, has the quality of the leopard in that Ignatz Mouse is the second in command, but is completely uncontrollable, is completely animal. Whereas, just the way
like Hicks.
Yeah, whereas the lion or Crazy Cat is not just animal, but is has remorse and has considerations and moderates feelings. Officer Pup struck me as rather similar to the ox in that the ox always has the lion's back, and the Officer Pup, who happens to be a dog, is always protective of Crazy and really loves Crazy, and if he ever sees Ignatz doing something nefarious, he wants to just throw him in jail. So there's some kind of funny similarities going on as characters in this famous strip. And I mean, it's also interesting that they have this place in our culture, and that this strip is this, it may be the greatest of them all, the most written about, and I think that The Peaceable Kingdom, although not written about maybe as well as people have written about Crazy, has that also that quality of being kind of an American classic. That's why I put it in.
And a short list of characters who develop over time.
Yeah. Except that in Crazy Cat, they don't seem to really develop. My memory is that there is an image towards the end of Harriman's life. I don't think it was his last strip, where I think Crazy is being carried as if in a shroud. I haven't looked at it in a long time. I don't think that, my memory tells me that Harriman didn't know that he was dying. It's been so long since I read the biography. So I don't think Harriman ended Crazy, but Hicks did end The Kingdoms. Hicks's work, when talking about getting animals to move, that's why he, I think, went to the image of Noah's Ark. I think that Hicks was very concerned with getting his animals out of there, because they were going somewhere, and he was going somewhere too.
Somewhere better.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Yeah, because Hicks talks about his death a good deal.
And it was the last picture he touched within what, like 24 hours?
The last one. It wasn't completely finished. I think his son finished it, but it was pretty much finished, and he died. Yeah, so it was very much a sign off.
So Sandy, you've been in the room that he painted in.
No. I when I visited his house, we were not invited in by Mrs. Mirsky, who was an artist. But maybe I should give her a copy of the book, and I can go in.
And so Hicks,
I'll do that.
Hicks could have actually seen his plot from his back doorstep. Yeah, because in those days, the houses that are there now between his house and the meeting were not there. So kind of a direct view. Yeah, he would have seen that. And he also talks about in his diary, talks about working in his shop and not realizing that there had been a burial of someone he knew. And he was so busy working, we don't know what he was working on, that he missed it completely. And he said, I'm dumbfounded. I just forgot, I mean, it's so unlike me. And as a minister, he would often speak at funerals.
he as a minister, he often dug the graves. So he was very involved with death. He was very involved with mortality.
Let's we've touched on a lot. Let's give people a chance to ask a few questions.
Sure.
Yes, we should definitely move to the Q&A. I think there are
Okay.
some interesting comments I'm seeing in the chat. So please speak up. Don't hesitate to say your comments out loud.
Well, sure. With the Rousseau background. Firstly, I just want to thank you all so much for such a rich conversation, and thank you, Sanford, for this wonderful book and this research you've done, and for sharing it with us. And I'd like to encourage everyone, posted the link in the chat for the book that you can get through DAP. So check that out. But we do have lots of questions. We'll try to get to a couple of them now. First, I'm going to pass the mic to our friend, G.E. Schwartz. So G.E., you should be able to turn your mic on now.
Thanks. I saw that name before, but not now.
Is your mic, is it working, G.E.? Well, let's.
He's on mute.
He will be unmuted by Nick.
So GE, I think we're having an issue with your microphone. We're going to come back to you, but first I'm going to pass the mic then over to Diane Tepfer. Diane, you should be able to turn your mic on now.
Yes, as the author of the 1989 dissertation on Edith Gregor Halpert in the Downtown Gallery, I too, was glad to rediscover her promoting Leger's comments about Hicks. Supposedly, Leger also said was more important than, pardon me, than Rousseau. And he also liked the painting that she showed in her American Ancestors 1931 exhibition of Pickett.
Yeah, it's a great artist.
Yes. And the one that she showed in 1931 that Leger showed is now in the Abbey Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Museum in Virginia.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Diane, for that.
Thank you.
Whoops, I'm going to pass the mic now to our good friend, Lynn Crawford.
Oh, thank you. This was a real tapestry of fascinating observations and information. And I was really hoping we could get GE's questions in because they were so great. This is very banal, but I'm sure he read the Bible, but I'm curious if there were any other literary influences in his life that might have informed some of these works.
Yeah, he. In addition to reading the Bible, like, am I on?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Okay. He, like a lot of people in that era, he committed a lot of the Bible to memory.
Oh.
And when you read the sermons, it's amazing. He quotes at length. I mean, he just has it in him. And a Quaker minister was not supposed to write down anything beforehand. And Edward, always very much looking for people doing the wrong thing, would talk about some ministers who would scribble some notes, and sort of because they couldn't remember all the things in the Bible. This was a no-no. But other literary sources, someone had asked me, what he knew of Shakespeare. And I can't answer that, except there is a painting of I think The Tempest, and it's been questioned as to whether it is a Hicks. I don't know, I confess, I can't say how widespread knowledge of Shakespeare was, say, in rural communities in the 1830s. One feels that Shakespeare was known and that someone would have had some connection with the place. I mean, Hicks's children went to art exhibitions in Philadelphia. So I'm, you know, which he wouldn't do. But as a young man, he was in and out of Philadelphia all the time, so he would have had access. But he doesn't. But in his memoir and in his diary, I don't remember his talking about any person we would consider, or any subject we would consider a literary source.
So the Bible was pretty much his literary.
That was the main thing.
And he read and reread it.
That was, yeah, and he, you know, and to memorize passages for sure.
Thank you so much for this, and I look forward to your book very much.
Oh,
thank you.
you're welcome.
It's a gorgeous book to read. I mean, the way Sandy writes is just such an immense pleasure to read. No, I mean, it's fully documented, but not in the boring academic way. It's a true pleasure to read it. So I highly recommend.
It's not long.
And it's not long. So it's a very humane and accessible format. I mean, also the size of the book, the format, the layout, the length, everything is very,
you can take it to bed.
Reachable. Yes, definitely.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Lynn. And I agree, GE, you've shared so much wonderful stuff in the chat today. Let's try your mic again.
Okay, I think I'm here, correct?
Yay.
We got you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your patience and your diligence, because this Hicks has been so important to me since I first saw his work in the Philadelphia Museum of Art when I was like 7. So, I mean, it's been one of those cosmic things in my life ever since. And he's been a companion in that sense, and part of an Americana that I cherish. We do know that Edward Hicks did read the works of the ornithologist and really prolific poet, Alexander Wilson.
Oh yeah, sure.
Who himself read very deeply both of the poets Edward Young, the British poet, very, very insightful philosophical poet, and John Clare, the naturalist poet, who tried himself to rally against the destruction of his beloved Hempston. Did Hicks read them as well? Did he read Young or Clare? And then my follow-up then with that is, and if he did, this would seem to open up a kind of different interpretation of the peaceful kingdom, in my own itinerant way of saying it, as not only that they're itinerant theological works of the Quakerism and everything, but it's an ecological cry against being turned from our natural moorings, torn away from our natural moorings, in the way that maybe atomized and alienated him to seek to affirm his sense of identity within his environment and create that environment and then live inside that kind of environment in his paintings.
Yeah, that's a good point about Alexander Wilson, who's in my book and who I fell in love with while writing the book. And I had planned on a very lengthy footnote on Alexander Wilson, which I thought was maybe inappropriate. Yes, Edward Hicks, you're completely right. Not only read Wilson's account of his trip to Niagara Falls, which is still available, but he went to the falls because of Wilson's writing about it, and in Wilson's book he talks about hearing, cougars and at night in the camps, and when you read Wilson on wildlife that one would have encountered on a trip from the Philadelphia area where Wilson was based to Canada and back, you feel that the animal life that was around people and in the 1820s was not very different from the animal life that you encounter in a kingdom. And in some of the writing that goes around on the borders, and the borders are really beautiful. The borders that have writing are gorgeous in themselves. And in the Niagara paintings, and there are two, they're kind of, one is a replica of the other in a sense, the writing is from Wilson. So, I mean, your point is terrific. Wilson would, but beyond that, the people who influenced Alexander Wilson, I have not encountered Clare's name in Hicks's writing. It doesn't mean he didn't know him. One of the books that was in Edward's library at his death was a book about the lives of the founders. That was very important to him, and he seems to have marked it up. So the very close immediate American past was very important.
Where is that book now?
It might be in the Historical Society in Newtown, but I can't say for sure. And it may have just descended in the family like a lot of other things, and then, gotten rid of it.
I thank you so much, and I've ordered the book. Thank you.
Thank you, GE, and thank you so much, Sanford. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Anya Bernstein. Anya, you can, there you are.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation today. And earlier, Sanford, I was thinking, you were joking that when you went to Hicks's home, you were asked by the woman who lives there now if you have a new angle to a book on Hicks. And I'm just wondering that if in your deep research, what has been the most surprising or new part of Hicks that you've discovered, or perhaps something that you weren't expecting to find in your research?
Well, in reading Alice Ford's biography, which is the first and really the best biography, and she wrote about him again, I was surprised by his sort of inflammatory character. She modulated this point in her second book on him, but in her first book, which was coming from the sources, she talked about him as a somewhat violent character, very neurotic, and a lot of that surprised me because I came to this, like a lot of people, without a great sense of Edward Hicks as a person and as an individual. I knew when Mrs. Mirsky at Hicks's former house asked me what my angle was, that's different from the question you're asking, but I knew what my angle was all along, which was that I didn't want to write about him strictly in terms of Quaker thought. I wanted to write about him as an artist, there's a lot of good writing on Hicks, but almost none of it is about Hicks as an imaginative creator. It's about Hicks as someone who is connected to a system of belief. And I knew it just didn't feel right to me, because as I kept on seeing his paintings in the context of American 19th century paintings, he stood out for me. He was saying different things, and he was able, unlike so many 19th century American painters, to be interested in character and in people. And I think of the animals, some of them as basically humans. And so I came to it with that, but this is an indirect and lame answer to your question, that only increased as I worked. But I was surprised by his virulence, and he's very honest about it.
I think that's what makes it so exciting. And reading your book, that's what I found, because of this very peaceable, nice, almost cute imagery that you have, and the inner violence and the struggle, and this contrast was one of the most exciting aspects of his work and persona as well.
Yeah, definitely. That painting that we've seen already, the painting in Brooklyn, where the leopard and the lion have the black lines around their eyes, and they're clearly like either frightened and they are frightening. I think that's as close as American painting gets to expressionism in certainly in the mid 19th century or in the 19th century. I mean, if you go to Brooklyn and look at that painting, well, maybe you're in Brooklyn already. It's a very strong and very striking, almost expressionist picture. it's a family picture, and it's a group portrait. I thought of these, I think, at a certain early point also as what art historians called genre pictures, pictures of people together. Hogarth did a number of them. There's not so many in American painting, but the Dutch did them, and one sees them. And I think this is as close as American art in that time gets to genre painting. I don't know. That's my answer.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you, Sanford. I most definitely want to go to the Brooklyn Museum this weekend. Here at the Rail, our tradition is to pass the mic for the final question to our artistic director and publisher, Phong H. Bui. Phong, you can turn on your mic now.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Sandy.
Oh, you're welcome, Phong. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Choghakate. I'm making a photo of Jasper Johns because we are doing that for the last minute before the winter issue. So it's a pleasure. Can you guys see it okay?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's not done. It will be done. But anyway, the point is, what a pleasure making the portrait while listening to this amazing conversation. Right, Lynn?
He has infused, we hope that the spirit of Edward Hicks has infused Jasper Johns.
Well, you know, I wouldn't surprise me that Jasper will pay attention to Hicks, even though he doesn't quite explicitly use it, certainly done it with other people. But it was great that G brought up Edward Young, because his book, Night Thoughts on Life, Death, and Immortality, have a significant influence at the time, certainly with William Blake, you know, for sure, Sandy.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking that you mentioned, you guys all talk about Pippin, and it's so important to bring up also the finally let go of Alfred Barr at MoMA. That was 1943, the same year that he put up the huge retrospective of self-taught artists, Polish, you know, Polish-born American artist, self-taught artist, Morris Hirschfeld. Remember, Sandy?
Yeah.
All right, so that's 1940.
That was the one that took the trustees over the edge, right?
That's right. It was so intense. He was fired during the course of the show. But what is so interesting on that year was that Leger was here teaching at Yale. He was in New York, and he was teaching at Yale for several years. He was in New York between 1940 to 1945. So we know the famous story when Maya Shapiro brought him to see the Acopolis, the Beatus manuscript at the Morgan Library. And the same was that they also went to see Morris Hirschfeld. So he was super aware of Hirschfeld, and that he was with, you know, I would say all the great self-taught artists in France too. But my question is this, what do you think? We know the successive evolution of American art began with what was called primitivism, and then it evolved into throughout puritanical, or at least Puritanism. And then it went gradually to transcendentalism. So, and then evolved thereafter. My question is that how, when we think about the increased secularization with the old and new, which was exactly what Jonathan Edwards did when he was at Yale. You remember the Great Awakening? Then the first American artist that was sent to Europe to study was Jonathan Copley, John Singleton Copley. So the point was that I wonder, these are early because Copley and Edward was at least 30, 40 years earlier. So my point is that I wonder if Hicks was aware of that tradition.
No, he just wasn't. I mean, I think we'd be amazed nowadays where we know everything that's going on at all times in all the arts. And we kind of assume that people maybe have had some similar relationship, but no. I mean, there were no, I don't think that Edward would have had any inkling of Copley, who at that point was, if not dead, certainly British, you know, because he had moved to London and took up that life and was making a completely different kind of painting than he had made in Boston. And Edward Hicks's connection with earlier America was pretty political. It was about Washington and Jefferson. It was about the founders, and that because that was crucially important for him. He was patriotic in that sense, as many people were who were born in the 1780s and thereabouts. I mean, he was born with a taste of the colony still in him. You know, but no, I don't, those kind of antecedents just, no, he was too isolated for that. I mean, he was both a Quaker and he was a rural Quaker. I mean, he was really out of it. And I think that he absorbed things without being conscious of them by simply working from so many publications. Because as Brandt was saying, I mean, these paintings are collages taken from everybody's publication. I mean, he was always looking at things, as were other so-called folk artists. I mean, Thomas Chambers, who's one of our greatest landscape painters, who recently has been seen in Philadelphia, and really a wonderful painter from the same period of time. I mean, these are all copies. They were all copies of small black and white images. People were always working from black and white, small black and white images, like George Caleb Bingham. Who made really strong, but Copley, no. I mean, Hicks would have perhaps looked for such a thing if he was interested in portraiture.
But you know what I mean, though, because you take Horace Pippin, for example. Pippin might have been self-taught himself, but he was so cosmopolitan. He in fact was the person who insisted to bring Dr. Barnes before the Barnes Foundation was formed, before the museum was created. They would come to New York almost every week, weekly, Sandy, to audit John Dewey's lectures at Columbia University. You know, so he was very well aware of what was being shown in New York, and yet he chose to paint or make the picture that he did. That's the reason why I'm asking, really.
Well, Horace Pippin couldn't have changed his spots overnight because he knew Dr. Barnes. Dr. Barnes and other people in that community who had a strong interest in contemporary and recent European art were very delighted with Pippin. I forget the name of the person who basically so-called discovered or found Pippin, whose a painting of whose was in a shop in Westchester. This man also lived in that town, and he was the one who organized that first Pippin exhibition. And Barnes, living in the same area, and Barnes with his very strong connection to African art, which he had been learning about and collecting already in Paris, and which you see when you go to the Barnes Foundation. For Dr. Barnes, Horace Pippin, whether you like this or not, was really a continuation and an emanation of Black art, of African art. I mean, that's the way he and some of his colleagues would talked about Pippin, and that was why they embraced Pippin. They thought there was something coming from that American art needed, and it was and had another spirit. But Pippin was really settled where he was in that small city, and you know, when he went to Philadelphia, it was, and occasionally went to New York. I mean, this was all fine and all very exciting to him, and put him at odds with his contemporaries who were not being courted. But there was no need for him to change his way of thinking. I do forget the name of the man who pulled his work out.
William Glackens.
Well, Glackens was collected by Barnes too, wasn't he?
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
friend also. Yeah. But I was thinking, anyway, it's just terrific. Thank you so much, Sandy, because I
thanks.
remember once talking to Alan Caparel when he was still with us, how even Bob Thompson had picked up Horace Pippin, you know, in kind of a very indirect way. So I think that the subtlety of that indirect influence is so, you know, unexpected. That's why I asked such a question. But Sandy, it's a great book. So every one of us should go and buy one, order one. And congratulations. I'd love to see you in person soon.
Yeah.
And when will you guys write for the Rail again? Hello.
Oh, as soon as the New York Review rejects an article.
You get the best of it. The rejected ones are the best, always.
Yeah, well, I still remember your editing of my article on Surratt's drawings. So thank you.
But the point is that, you know, New York Review of books should be called New York Review of each other's book. You get people reading. When you write for the Rail, you get millions of people reading it.
Yeah.
Sandy, thank you. Great to see you.
Thanks a lot, fun.
Thank you, Brandt.
Thank you.
Choghakate.
See you all later.
Back to you. Can't wait for the poetry reading. Back to you, Nikki.
Yes, thank you, Phong, and thank you, Sanford, for such a wonderful response. And a few of us in the background really loved your phrase, if not dead, certainly British. We really appreciate that. But here at the Rail, we do have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. So today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, David Zaza, to the stage. David Zaza is a partner at McCall Associates, a design company specializing in museum and gallery publications. His poetry has been published in various magazines since 1992, and recent multidisciplinary projects include the Goldberg Variations, an audio work which presents his recited poetry with piano accompaniment, Before and After, or At the Same Time, a poem illustrated with 3 charcoal drawings, and Unreliable, a poetry/drawing collaboration with visual artist Mark Fox. Without further ado, David, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Nick. I'm really delighted to be part of this series, and today's talk was fantastic. I'm going to read 4 poems. The first is from the poetry drawing collaboration that I'm working on with Mark Fox. The poem's called Wave Goodbye. Wave goodbye, white hanky in hand, early evening train, and I want nothing on the wane of a grand central fade out. The colors pop and trains roar out, and it's all wrong because you're the only thing disappearing. From here they go northwest, these tracks, forged steel paths to glory lie and twist with a passion as blankly subdued as my own emotion. We worry only the minutes and the jokes of the days of distanced reunions like tomorrows run on. Temporary measures make me as weak as a widow, as a window blowing open to reveal something new. Innocent days and silent years may go by and by. You're so good at riding through nights at Coney Island, high as a bird and spiking your words. But here you're just silent, put in the distant hub, in motion, by walking through. Nothing as welcoming as it is rank. You rose is a rose and then you sank, spikes and all below the surface. But it's whiskey, not water, and you just can't. I tell you what to say, but back then you could never remember. Will I ever see this face-making face again, singing or cutting wordlessly to rest? The conductor conducts me off the train, and he wouldn't whistle, and neither will I. Imagine the heartbreak. Turns out it was fake. When we focus, we should focus on the best and let our friends find us fine in our skinny punk pants. I remember I'm sorry you're leaving. Last call. Last dance. The next poem illustrates a suite of 3 charcoal drawings that I made examining simultaneous events. It's called Before and After, or At the Same Time. The car flies through time as much as it does the sky toward the house. The house remembers it burned only after the car came crashing in. The landscape disappears, as so many landscapes do, to smears of coal. Though not possible, there are no people in the car, nor in the house. From here, the light is light and the shadows harsh, in stark contrast. From now on, time is still, even though the car flies and the house burns. The sun burns too, up in its sky, as earth burns too, here on earth. The third poem takes place in Walter de Maria's New York Earth Room, which was dug up in 1986 after a false rumor suggested that the body of Eton Pates was buried there. The ghost of Eton Pates. I am diffuse. I am loose as vapor, filling an inert room. Like air, I am where there is nothing else. And though they came looking, and though they came digging, there was apparently nothing. So I am always missed and never found in the New York Earth Room. It's decades now, though time is timeless in this state. Don't speak of dimensions or that it's decades now, in the dirt, in the dust, in the small spaces between the crumbs of earth that fill my home. I was physical, sidewalking, and as curious as a boy alone in the world for the first time. It was just similes, because really, I was the same thing I am now, only concentrated and in form. But the particular form in which this thing existed is still simply missed. Now I am just out of reach. One may think in this angled evening sunlight, I am going to appear, warm in the warmth, dusty as memory, that I'm limnable in these very words. I am not. I am abstracted from spirit, neither of shadow nor light, and I move around the spare specks floating in the air, barely there, in a peace as thin and unhaunted as a calm. The final poem is an ode, but the title is Spanish rather than French, in a nod to the Spanish-speaking neighborhood the poem takes place in, and the salsa rhythm in its heart. Alborada. I lie in blissful stupor as a beautiful light lets summer inside from the heights. I have shed all my energies and let my passions overflow. Now my heart rate settles down, calmness rises around me. Today's lover floats through this apartment of his, doing nothing really, just gliding on the warm air, breathing through the sheer curtains. From downstairs, from out on the sidewalk, we hear music young men are playing, their radio filtering up through the heat, a sultry voice singing longingly over a salsa rhythm. The song starts slowly, but when a violin sounds and women's voices drift in, my man says something about nostalgia, opens the window a bit more, and quietly sings along. The sung Spanish sounds sensual, and I absorb the feeling and watch him coyly dance, swaying his hips, his hands swimming in the liquid warmth. I feel close to him and far away at the same time. I breathe in his scent, and a longing, deep and expressive, rises from my own naked, quiet body. He smiles seriously, then withdraws once again into reverie or memory and becomes almost invisible in the gaze and gauze of pulsing euphoria. Without touching me, he touches me once again, ending our short affair with a kiss. I walk out, past the young men and their music, and find my way through the bright afternoon sunshine. I am alive and awake, and morning is breaking. Again, many thanks to the Rail for having me today. I'm really honored to be here.
Thank you so much, David. What a beautiful way to end our event today. Thank you for joining us. Once more, I would love to thank Sanford, Choghakate Brandt for this generous and wonderful conversation today. We'd also like to thank Art Book and DAP for helping to make today's program possible, and where you can also get your copy of On Edward Hicks. Once more, we'll put in the chat. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations on our YouTube channel, where we will upload today's conversation shortly. Join us on Monday at 1 p.m. for a conversation between artist Christy Rupp and Rail editor-at-large Eleanor Hartney on Rupp's new publication, Noisy Autumn, Sculpture and Works on Paper, where we will also conclude with a poetry reading by Bob Holman. You can now all turn on your microphones, say hello and goodbye, and I wish you all a good weekend, and thank you all for joining.
Bravo, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
David.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Goodbye, David. It was
I
great.
enjoyed it like always, but I had big fun. Thank you for the time.
David, that was
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful reading.
Thank you, David.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank you,
Beautiful
Sanford.
conversation.
Thank you, Choghakate. Thank you,
so
Brandt. Thank you,
much.
David.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Thank you. Amazing. Yes, yes, yes. Beautiful.
Thanks, Cal.
Thank you
Thanks, David.
very much.
Thank you so much. This is really great.
Take care.
Really great.
Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you, David, for the beautiful reading.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Curator for our radical poetry reading. We'll send you an invite super soon. Sandy, I see you super soon.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Bye.
Bye, you
Take
guys.
care. Be safe, everyone.
Bye,
Take care.
GD.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a
Have a
great,
good
safe
weekend.
weekend. Bye, Fawn.
GE.
Bye, Lynn. Bye.
Bye, you guys.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Encourage.
Bye.